So welcome to our second week on education policy with a discussion that centers on the role of segregation in education. So for today, we're going to be talking about the Brown versus Board cases and the Coleman report. These are all seminal federal actions that were intended to ultimately integrate public schools today, or assess how integrated they were. We're also going to talk about the state of segregation and education today, as well as the effects of policy on segregation. I should note here that segregation is often discussed in racial terms, which we certainly get into today, but there's also economic segregation, which is, of course, interrelated with racial segregation. I think we are all likely familiar with this 1954 case, but just to refresh everyone's memory, this case overturns the Plessy versus Ferguson separate but equal doctrine, where schools and other spaces could be segregated based on race, with schools for white children and schools for black children. This ruling does away with that. Brown, just to be clear, isn't necessarily a single case. This was actually 5 cases from separate school districts in Delaware, DC, Kansas, South Carolina, and Virginia, and these cases were held at the end of 1952. The court then hears a second set of oral arguments in December of 1953. At the time, though, this is obviously a very controversial decision, and it's one of the reasons that this case takes so long to be ruled on. And so another 5 months after December 1953 passed, when the court comes to a unanimous conclusion to ultimately overturn the separate but equal doctrine. In sum, it takes about 2 years for the Supreme Court to rule on this issue, and it doesn't end there. In 1955, because there is such a lack of integration of schools actually occurring, the court issues an enforcement decree, with Chief Justice Warren stating that local governments and school districts need to become fully compliant with desegregation, stating that they need to act, quote, with all deliberate speed, end quote. Still, desegregation isn't fully enforced until the Green versus County School Board and Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg cases in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Ultimately, Brown v. Board doesn't necessarily provide a quick and easy end to segregation. It is neither deliberate nor speedy. But it does create the legal grounding to eliminate segregation broadly, not just in school spaces. And it provides a framework for the Civil Rights Movement and ultimately the Civil Rights Act. In the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there is a portion called Section 402, and it required that the government conduct a survey then to be given to Congress and the President that examines, and I quote, the lack of availability of equal educational opportunities for individuals by reasons of race, color, religion, or national origin in public educational institutions. The Office of Education designates James Coleman, who you see here, to survey the United States about the state of education in the country. In sum, he surveys 4,000 schools and 650,000 school children. This had never been done before, like on this scale. There were not standardized tests to rely on. They didn't know how much money was being spent per pupil by district. All of this was a mystery. So ultimately, this was just an enormous undertaking. And really, this report was intended at first to simply measure how far we'd come in terms of school segregation and funding. But ultimately, Coleman pushes it much further than that, examining student outcomes as well. Intuitively, he finds that schools are still segregated at the time in the 1960s. This is really not a surprise, even then. It didn't take a report at the time to know that schools were still massively segregated. And he does find that outcomes are surprisingly inequitable. Specifically, this report finds that the average black 12th grader in the South had an achievement level that was more in line with a white 7th grader from the cities in the Northeast. So they're 5 grades behind white children in the Northeast. In other words, there are huge achievement gaps between black and white children, and these are achievement gaps that still persist even to today. Now, what do expenditures look like today? How much of this has persisted? The deeper the teal that you see here, this means the school district spends more than the US average. And the deeper the orange or red, that means the district spends less than the US average. School districts in the South, here, and parts of the Midwest, like Michigan and Iowa, spend less than the US average. But also parts of the West, like Idaho and Utah. Places that spend more include portions of the Northeast. Obviously, that's where we see a lot of teal. Wyoming, Montana, parts of Texas, and parts of California as well, sort of patches here and there. And so ultimately, we see a lot of differences across the country when it comes to expenditures. Now, how does this relate to outcomes? This measures how Black students in a district perform compared to their white peers. The deeper the blue, the more inequitable the outcome, where Black students perform worse than their white peers. If it's gray, that means that there's not data available. But as you can see, there is a consistent achievement gap between Black and white children in the South. Clearly, there is some overlap between the places with lower levels of funding, particularly in the South, and the achievement gap, right? We see not very high spending in the South, and then also pretty wide achievement gaps in the South as well. In this figure, the deeper the blue, this means there is an uneven distribution of Black students and white students across school districts, across districts in schools. And again, clearly, the South has significant segregation in their school systems. Now, if we're to examine segregation in schools, we have to also look at the policy roots of segregation in the United States. Segregation is not something that naturally happened. This is something that we have perpetuated with public policies over the past century. So here, we're going to talk about white flight first. Now, the term white flight refers to the exodus of white people from racially and ethnically mixed urban centers to racially homogeneous and oftentimes white suburbs, particularly in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. But this white flight, and therefore segregation, was made possible by policy, right? This was not done just based off of people wanting to move. This was perpetuated and encouraged through public policy. The first of those policies that we're going to highlight today, and this list is not exhaustive, is redlining. So when the Federal Housing Administration was established in 1934, they wanted to increase housing availability to Americans because there was a shortage. In order to do so, the federal government backed many mortgages, both back then and even today, for lenders, so that if someone defaulted, the federal government was financially backing that loan. But there were conditions to this backing about which homes they would federally support for lenders. In order for lenders to determine what housing could have a federally insured mortgage, the federal government created maps of every metro area in the country. So this is Macon County, Georgia. And they were color-coded, these maps. Red indicates that Black people in high proportions lived there or lived near there. And it indicated to appraisers and lenders that these neighborhoods were too risky to insure the mortgages. This ultimately means that whites are prohibited from purchasing properties in predominantly Black communities. The federal government will not back or insure these mortgages that are in these red areas, which are predominantly Black neighborhoods. Moreover, the FHA was super explicit about discrimination. In their handbook, it stated that, and I quote, "Incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities," meaning that loans to African Americans could not be insured if they wanted to live in predominantly white neighborhoods. This ultimately means that the federal government will not allow whites to purchase homes in Black communities, like you see here, these red communities, but also that Blacks are not allowed to purchase homes in white communities. And this is true until 1968 when we passed the Fair Housing Act, which finally allows Black people to purchase homes in white neighborhoods. But this is nearly 2 whole generations of Black people who are unable to purchase a home in these nicer neighborhoods where they could have accrued greater equity and greater assets and greater wealth. This is 2 whole generations or more of wealth accumulation for African Americans that was not allowed. The second of those policies is racial covenants. These are clauses in your deed that would state that you can't rent or sell your home to Black people, Asian people, Jewish people, or other racial or ethnic or religious minorities. If you purchase this home, that means you're unable to be able to sell or rent to those groups, depending on the details of the clause. The Supreme Court upholds and validates racial covenants in 1926, and it becomes quite common after that time. It's not until 1948 that the Supreme Court ultimately strikes down the law. But other discriminatory practices by real estate agents and property owners remain in place until the 1968 Fair Housing Act, where it becomes illegal for property owners and real estate agents to prohibit from renting or showing homes and properties to racial and ethnic minorities. The next 2 policies that focus on economic segregation as opposed to racial segregation. So this one, our third policy here, is contemporary. Particularly, it's more restrictive land use and zoning, and it tends to lead to greater economic segregation, as you read in your reading. It's not all land use and zoning, but some facets of zoning. Specifically, your reading notes that there is greater segregation where there are more land use restrictions, like local project approvals, local zoning approvals, and multiple levels of approval to get housing built. This is because rules such as these make it more difficult for new housing to become developed. And new housing would likely encourage desegregation and integration in many respects. Ultimately, places where it's more difficult to build housing and places where it's more restrictive of growth become more segregated. And the final one, closely related to land use and zoning, is density requirements, interestingly. They tend to increase economic segregation. In the words of Richard Florida, these density requirements allow wealthy enclaves to isolate themselves from people from lower classes. Now, for today, we covered Brown versus the Board of Education, both cases, and the Coleman Report, the state of segregation in education, and finally, the effects of policy on segregation. Clearly, we have both a racially and economically segregated school system, and I don't think that's a mystery to anyone. But we should also acknowledge that there are roots of policy here, that policy shapes segregation, which in turn shapes education. So when we talk about education, we need to see how it relates to other facets of public policy in the United States, because this is not a policy silo. Education is related to housing. It is related to segregation. It is related to healthcare. And when we think about this one, when we think about education, we need to be cognizant of this, okay? So for discussion section, we're going to be talking about state and local education systems, the policy roots of segregation, how segregation affects education, and potential policy solutions, given that this is tied up with other policy arenas. But I will see you all in your discussion section.